Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS.
And a very warm welcome to our weekly review of international relations. What we do in this review is not only to underline important events, important issues that are relevant for our foreign policy that impinge on our national interest, but we also like to share with you comparative analysis, insights provided by different analysts, so you can evaluate these events in your own mind, come to your own conclusions. And when you appear for the competitive examinations, the quality of your answers is far superior to what others are writing, because you gain insights into it, you get sidelights into what is happening in international affairs, you begin to appreciate the interrelationships. And what a eventful week this has been for the past few days. There are events and incidents in our immediate neighborhood, some a little distance removed in different continents, which are likely to change, if not the paradigm immediately, but in coming years, the power equations among great powers and regional powers. So we intend to do with you this. The incident that, in a manner of speaking, shook international relations was the drone attack launched by Houthi rebels in a target in UAE, and not any target in UAE. The drones targeted the Abu Dhabi International Airport and an oil refining facility next to it. It created a loud explosion and lives were lost. So this is the first time when lives have been lost in Emirate due to an attack launched by the Houthi rebels in Saudi Yemen. Now, the people who died, two were Indian laborers, one was a Pakistani laborer, which again is an issue of great concern, not only to India and Pakistan, but to all the countries where from the immigrants go in search of a better future to Emirate, to Gulf countries. And what has happened is there is a very large population of expatriate laborers, skilled professionals, etc. So this was a event which shook everybody. Now, there are two or three other things which we have to consider carefully. In the past few weeks, much has been made of the Abrahamic Accords, the normalization of relationship between Israel, the traditional enemy of the Arabs, and the Emirate people. Some Arab nations have called it a betrayal by the Emirate of the interests of their Arab brethren. But this Abrahamic Accords, the normalization, the beginning of the process between Israel and Emirate, and then maybe one step removed with Oman, Muscat, and Saudi Arabia, had held out hopes of reduction of tensions in this region. Suddenly, this is a reminder that how explosive the situation is. The effort of the Emirate countries, especially Abu Dhabi and Dubai, has been to project an image of an oasis of peace, prosperity, tranquility in a turbulent sea where a lot of violence takes place. This has attracted a lot of multinational companies to set up their head offices there to deal with not only the Middle Eastern region, but to reach out into the Far East, look at the countries in South Asia. Very many European countries think that it's a great pleasure ground for them. It is a great opportunity to provide employment for high-tech skilled people, workers from their countries. So whether it is Germany, whether it is France, whether it is UK, even the Americans in the oil sector, and of course, in India and Pakistan and Philippines and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and Nepal have a very great interest in peace, tranquility, and prosperity of this region. Now, before we come to the root cause of this, what does this mean? Because it's not only a shocking reminder that the place is not as tranquil as it appears on the surface. The effort of Abu Dhabi, Dubai has been to tell the world that this is where they are trying to change their economic development from dependence on fossil fuels to green energy resources, maybe even nuclear energy, other high-tech production facilities, which would allow them to interact and have a more interdependent relationship with the major economies of the world. This suddenly puts a big question mark in front of all this. If the Houthi rebels from South Yemen can target with such ease strategic and economic targets in Abu Dhabi, can anybody risk building a nuclear reactor there? So the ambitions of the Emirate to project themselves as, centers of dynamic economic development, forward looking, changing their ways, is all put into a question now. Now let's get back to the rebels, the Houthi rebels in Saudi Yemen. The world had almost forgotten about the ongoing civil war in Yemen, in which more than almost close to 400,000 lives have been lost, millions more have been displaced. The great humanitarian crisis, according to the United Nations itself, is brewing in South Yemen, where that might be an irretrievable famine, there might be malnutrition, there might be deaths. Now, the problem here is that if the Houthis target UAE, and the Abu Dhabi has vowed revenge and said very clearly that this is an attack on the sovereignty and independence of Abu Dhabi and the UAE, I think there is a counter argument which not the Houthis, not only the rebels, but the Yemenis could make, that what about their autonomy? What about their sovereignty? Hasn't there been for the past so many years interference in their sovereignty by Saudi Arabia, which supports what it says is the legitimate government and disregards totally the claims, occupation, etc. of the Houthi rebels. Now, the Houthi rebels have been assisted by Iran, and it goes deep down into the Shia-Sunni divide in this region. Iranis are Shias, Houthis are assisted by them. The Iranis are also helping out rebels in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon. So there is this threat of the Iranians trying to control developments in this region, and Saudi Arabians who think that they are the legitimate leaders of all the Sunnis in the world, also the custodians of the holy places of the Muslims, shrines in Makkah and Medina, and also a very rich oil country. They are among the largest purchasers of military hardware, and they think that their money can buy them all the protection, not only the guarantees to their safety by the Americans, their allies, but also the anti-missile defense systems which they have. But repeatedly, the Houthis have shown that they can target with certain impunity. They have exposed the vulnerability of the Saudi Arabians against these drone attacks, against these missiles launched from the Gulf area. One might even add that the trouble had been brewing for the past few weeks. Ship flying the flag of UAE was stopped and taken into position by the Houthi rebels. Now, the UAE said that the ship was carrying medicines and other essential commodities to Yemen. The Houthi rebels maintain that this was an excuse. It was carrying on weapons for those anti-rebel forces there. Now, also there has been some inner contradictions between the UAE and Saudi Arabs. While the Saudi Arab, the Crown Prince MBS, had always protected the legitimate government, the elected government in Yemen, the UAE had not been as enthusiastic, and there were signs that they were helping out, at least providing some relief and respite to the rebels. But in recent past, post-Abrahamic Accord, there seems to have been a better coordination of anti-Houthi rebel warfare between the UAE and the Saudis. It was the Brigade of Giants sent by UAE which pushed back the Houthi rebels from major areas which they had controlled, and those who sympathize with the Houthi rebels have said that the Yemenis have a legitimate complaint that they have been pushed back by the combined forces recently of UAE and Saudi Arab, and all they are doing is to protect their survival and their interest. And so when they are pushed out of a port, when they are pushed out of a strategic position where air force attacks are launched against civilian population, then nobody in international community raises a finger. But when they retaliate something to draw the world's attention to their own plight, then all hell seems to fall on them. Now, there has been a variety of reasons to analyze this development. One is that, this incident, was it triggered by the Houthis trying to show the world that while they are trying to make a separate peace with Iran, whether it is the talk in Vienna about the ongoing talk in Vienna about Iran's nuclear program, or the Americans thinking of withdrawing with a face-saving formula the additional sanctions which Donald Trump had imposed on Iran, because the only consequence of these sanctions seems to be that Iran being pushed more and more in the corner of the Chinese. So while the Iranians are having a set of negotiations with the Americans on their own. They are taking some diplomatic initiative about arranging talks with Taliban. They are talking with Chinese. They are trying to buy and sell oil with other countries where American sanctions are there, Venezuela, maybe and elsewhere. Now the problem is it the independent action of the Houthis trying to show that they can on their own create some damage, make this whole region unstable, or is this a demonstration by Iranians through their proteges, the Houthis, to show the world that they better change their attitude towards Iran? Time is running out and Iranians will not wait for an infinity. They still are in a position, despite Abrahamic Accord, despite the American support to the Saudis and so on, to destabilize the whole region. But what is undeniable is that the vulnerability of the Emirate has been exposed. Now, Abu Dhabi was very famous for organizing F1 Formula races. Sharjah and Dubai were very prominent organizers of cricket matches. But all this, or the duty-free buying in Dubai, all this suddenly has become a little risky proposition. Would people like to go to a place where the airport is being attacked, where there might be violence elsewhere, where the civilians are targeted? And the Houthis have made it very clear that unless there is a compromise with them, they would be repeatedly doing this. Would the Emirate be in a position to retaliate? And if they retaliate, what would be the reaction to that? Now, one analyst has made it very clear that the oil-rich Emirate countries and Saudi Arabians have always thought that they can behave like big powers. They can buy arms, use them, demonstrate their use, and have protection. Now, unfortunately, this incident has exposed that even within region, what matters more is how powers outside the region, mightier than the Emirate countries, can do that. Countries with very small populations of their own, large expat populations, limited technological skill, achievements, accomplishment, very small resource base besides oil, have to consider this again and again. There is an unrest about feudal, dynastic, undemocratic, monarchical, unconstitutional rule in various countries. But then this tension at the moment has receded into the background. Right now we focus back again on the civil war in Yemen, the strength or weakness of Houthis, and the real strength and weakness in military terms of the Emirate countries, and how much even Saudi Arabia, the mighty Saudi Arabia, the rich Saudi Arabia, can do to get out of this mess. North Korea never ceases to surprise. When everything is tranquil, everything is quiet, it suddenly does something which shakes up the world. And this is exactly what happened in the past few weeks. It tested a hypersonic missile which surprised everybody. Now, what a hypersonic missile is, it is a missile which can fly at the speed of more than 5 to 6 times the speed of sound. And the speed makes it, and if it is a gliding hypersonic missile, it can travel even faster. It is even more difficult to trace on radars. So it is a weapon of stealth, a weapon of great steel, which is basically a game changer. Now, it is not the first time that the hypersonic missile has been tested. The Americans have tested a hypersonic missile. The Chinese have tested a hypersonic missile. The British claim that they also have the technology to use a hypersonic missile. What is surprising is that most of the world thinks that North Korea is only dependent on China as a protege, as a puppet state, for whatever weaponry it gets. But it is not that the Chinese have given a hypersonic missile, state-of-the-art, cutting-edge missile to North Koreans. The North Koreans have developed this. Now, this is one part of the thing. We will come to that in a minute. The North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, has also made a statement: if the world does not recognize the legitimate interests of North Korea, they will be forced to resume their nuclear tests. Now, these nuclear tests, the North Koreans had voluntarily given up in 2017, soon after a meeting was organized between Kim Jong-un and the then American President Donald Trump, first in Singapore, then in Hanoi. Great hopes were aroused that this might be a breakthrough, this might be a thaw. Nothing happened. Trump, as usual, thought that he was a strong man, Kim Jong-un was a strong man, they will get along fabulously, but it only reduced the demonization in Western media of Kim Jong-un. There was great interest aroused about North Korea, but there it stopped. There was a small thaw between the relationship between North Koreans and South Koreans also. There were great photo opportunities when both leaders of both nations walked midway till the boundary, etc. But this tension again was not reduced for a long time. The tension again was raised. Now, but the good result was that the North Koreans had stopped testing their intercontinental ballistic missiles or their tests of nuclear weapons. Now, these weapons, when they were testing, they were overflown Japan and they were overflown South Korea, obviously, and they created a threat of an accidental incident being triggered, which may be cataclysmic. Now, when Kim Jong-un now says that he is going to resume these tests and he has tested successfully a hypersonic missile, the combination of the two threatens. And he makes warlike noises against America. America is enemy number one, and he says now our missiles can reach American territory. So it may be the island of Hawaii, it may be their air bases, but the fact remains, it cannot be denied that the North Koreans have acquired these weapons. The third thing which is interesting in this context is the Kim Jong-un had recently made some interesting statements in party meetings. He has said that the priority economy is not doing as well as it is doing. We will have to give priority to economy. We have not been able to deliver. He came closest to admitting that even his topmost leadership had not delivered results, which is very, very unusual for North Korea. Let's not forget that Kim Jong-un is the third generation of dynastic succession. His grandfather, Kim Il-sung, was the person who came out with the ideology of Juche, which was a very strange mix of Korean traditional thought with communist thought. And the communist thought was, of course, that North Korea continues to be a communist country. But when you say a communist country, there is a great difference between a communist country, which may be a Stalinist, Leninist Russia, a revisionist Russia, Maoist China, a post-Maoist China, Vietnamese as a communist country, Cambodians as a communist country, Cubans as a communist country. So there are as many forms of communism and a combination of communism and nationalism and indigenous ideologies as there are states of this description. So North Korea was led by Kim Jong-un's grandfather when the Korean War was fought and the partition took place. But the fact remains that there has been no other ruler or family outside this family in North Korea since then. His father was also supposed to be an idiosyncratic, reclusive person, and they are worshipped almost like gods, demigods in North Korea, so we are told. Very little is known about North Korea. Even in past, the whole of Korean Peninsula, when it was united, it was referred to as the Hermit Kingdom by English scholars of that time. The Korean Peninsula's relationship with Japan and China has been a very fraught one throughout the history. The Koreans have been looked down upon by the Japanese, by Chinese, but their geostrategic location being what it is, neither can deny it. The Korean War showed the grit and determination of the Korean people to fight on, of course, with support of the Chinese, and take on the might of the Americans. So this is one part, that the contribution of the Kim Il-sung's family, his successors in Korea, has been mythologized. Also, the fact remains that the country is a closed country. Very little is known in the outside world about it. It also is a communist country. It takes great pride in its achievements, but those achievements are mostly in the field of military technology. And another interesting news item about North Korea in the past few weeks has been that the North Koreans mounted cyber attacks to hack bank accounts and have a heist of about $500,000 of cryptocurrency. Now, some scholars have suggested in the past year also they have done this, and they have stolen from other people's accounts $1 billion worth of cryptocurrencies. And they say that this money is then used to fuel their nuclear program, their rocketry, and so on. Which may be true, which may not be true, but what is interesting is that this allows us to appreciate the third field besides missile technology, besides nuclear technology, where the North Koreans have made significant progress on their own, is the cryptocurrency or the cyber warfare. Now, very few countries in the world can launch this kind of a cyber attack and hack other people's account. These recent events remind us of a period when People's Republic of China and Stalinist Russia, or even post-Stalinist Russia, were in one block. Russia was reluctant to share the state-of-the-art rocketry, nuclear weapons technology with China, and while it was, of course, willing to provide protection. But then this is what was a major schism between China and Russia. The scene seems to be something like this. The North Koreans have put everything on a stake, rule with an iron hand, have poverty, have famine-like conditions, but then almost 3 generations in North Korea have known nothing else. They know very little about the world outside. They know very little about how the rest of the world is governed. And they have managed to make on their own progress in key areas of strategic, whether it is nuclear, whether it is rocketry, whether it is cyber warfare. We can't forget this. Now, something which is very interesting, which we had mentioned a little earlier, for the first time, Kim Jong-un seems to be coming close to admitting that some policy corrections need to be made. Economy is in a bad shape, it has to be addressed. But the question is, can the economy be restored to health if so much of the scarce resources are being put in military hardware, weaponry, and cyber warfare against its enemies? An interesting thing is that very few of us remember that India is among few countries which maintain full diplomatic relations with North Korea. And although our trade has suffered with North Korea, we have been a major provider of foodstuff and medicines. Even during the COVID crisis, we provided the vaccine. But due to American sanctions, it has come down a little. There have been no high-level meetings. We don't propagate these, advertise these meetings when they take place. When the Minister of External Affairs meets a Korean leader in India at one stage, when General Singh was there, or when the ambassadors have talked. But India maintains a full-fledged embassy in Pyongyang, and North Korea maintains an embassy in India, in New Delhi. Our focus, which we shall discuss some other time, has more been on our relationship with South Korea, our economic relationship, automobiles, computers, electronics, etc. South Korea also has extremely interesting scientific capacity, from biotechnology to electronics. We shall, and automotives to shipping, to metallurgy, to chemicals, and so on. So, but what is the relationship between North Korea and South Korea needs to be examined very comfortably. Which country can we say, a country like India, which is coping with China, keeping in mind the very close strategic and economic relationship between North Korea and China, can India imagine to have a relationship with North Korea, which without jeopardizing its relationship with South Korea and other partners in East Asia, like Japan and maybe Taiwan? Can we maintain a very interesting balance between this relationship? But despite our border military clashes with China, actually our trade with China has increased. So this is ironical, but should we let our enmity and hostility with China, mostly manifested on China's part, hinder our relationship, independent relationship with other countries like Northeast? So will there be a change of course in coming days to restore economy to better health, as Kim Jong-un seemed to indicate in a speech of his? Or how does this fit in with the sudden acceleration of hostile attempts, like testing hypersonic missiles, threatening to resume nuclear weapons test, and doing that? Simple thing which we should never forget is that what little we know about North Korea is through Western media. And the Western media has focused on demonization of North Korea and the North Korean leadership. It may be more than an element, a small bit of exaggeration in that. But then our own resources, we have an embassy there, but we don't know how freely can we gather information about what is happening in that country. It remains a reclusive hermit country. The past few weeks, as we said, have been full of surprises, and the surprises did not stop. They included our neighborhood. Pakistan came out with a very comprehensive document of security and made two important declarations. The Prime Minister Imran Khan said that Pakistan is a country which is beset with very difficulties. It has very scarce resources. It has to cope with feeding its population. The economy is not in a very good shape. And he made two important statements that no nation can be secure, including Pakistan, unless there is human security, unless there is food security, unless there is energy security, unless there is economy which is developing well. Military security is not enough. He was candid enough to say in the past the governments were only concerned with military security, strategic security. It may have been important in the first phase of Cold War, but Pakistan has paid a very heavy price for concentrating only on military or strategic security. So that was interesting. And this policy document had taken 5-6 years into making. Lots of NGOs were involved, lots of interest groups were involved, lots of think tanks were involved, and it was with great fanfare that this policy document was unveiled. It is almost a 100-page document, but interestingly, what has been shared with the public, the Prime Minister was candid enough to say that no security document is shared entirely with the public. So the nitty-gritty of how when he was asked, you give very interesting goals, generalized goals, but we don't know what the roadmap is. So the Prime Minister and his security advisor, Dr. Moin Yusuf, made it very clear that the nitty-gritty of how a specific objective would be met cannot be shared with public all the time. So the supplements and the addendas of the 100-page document would have that. The second interesting thing which this Prime Minister of Pakistan made clear is, he says that we want peace with our neighbors. Now, this is interesting as far as India is concerned, because who are Pakistan's neighbors? Pakistan's border is shared, A, with India, the most important neighbor, and B, on the other side with Afghanistan, a very disturbed, unstable country at the moment. So how does Pakistan guarantee through this document that the wish to have good relations with India, with the neighbors, can be furthered? Now, as far as the response is concerned, there are 2 or 3 kinds of responses which this document has made. The critics within Pakistan have said that this is an effort by Imran Khan which is doomed to fail. He is trying to show that he, as a head of the civilian government, is in a control, and he is making for the first time a comprehensive security document, policy document for his country, which has a role for army, but not the central role. And this document has been made not dictated by the army, not dictated by the ISI, and it may have created enthusiasm among women's rights groups, among minorities, among people who are interested in the economic sector. But then how is it realized if the army doesn't buy this document? If the army is not a principal stakeholder, how effective can this enunciation of this document can be? How does India respond to this? India's response to this, again, is that as long as Pakistan does not curb anti-Indian activities of terrorists from its soil, we cannot take anything from Pakistan at its face value. When the Pakistani Prime Minister was confronted about Kashmir, he was blunt. His security advisor was blunt. They said that under the current regime in India, whom they call, not the Prime Minister, the Pakistani Prime Minister did not, but his security advisor said, as long as there is a fascist regime in India, as long as there is an ultra-nationalist Hindutva majoritarian regime in India, one cannot imagine that unless the government undoes what it has done in the Valley of Kashmir, he meant the abrogation of Article 370, reducing the state into 2 union territories. How do we expect that there can be normalization of relationship that is meaningful with this neighbor? The Indian argument is very, very strong that as long as the attacks on Indian soil are not stopped, the attacks by terrorists encouraged and nurtured, trained and sheltered by Pakistan, there can be no negotiation with Pakistan. But the whole point is the government of India also says that we cannot not talk with a neighbor like Pakistan. So the talks will continue. So the dilemma is still there despite the comprehensive policy document. Nobody could disagree with the broad objectives. The Indians also, they realize that the real strength of the country is its economic strength. There can be no military strength without proper economic development. There can be no stability at home unless the economic development pie is shared equitably with different sections of society. The interesting thing about Pakistan is that the admission of the inherent and essential weakness of Pakistan of a very small resource base. Now, unfortunately, the Pakistani economy has been bailed out of trouble by external powers like during the Cold War, the Americans, during the war in Afghanistan, the Americans, and to a very large extent for the past half century by the Chinese to cut India down to size. Now, can there be a revival of the economy of a country which has been, after its dismemberment in 1971, indeed has a very small resource base and very high expectations of its population, which also has multiple ethnicities, which has regional imbalances, and which also has lived under large-scale corruption and nepotism against army rule. Now, this is something which I think we should focus on. Why we are drawing your attention to this is that whenever in this country we discuss Pakistan, we discuss in terms of a military or a strategic challenge, either of a conventional war, limited or however otherwise, or nuclear blackmail, or Pakistan being used as a soil, as a nursery for terrorist attack on India. So we always think in terms of a security threat vis-a-vis Pakistan. We make general statements that we wish Pakistan well. If Pakistan is unstable, it is bad for us. But we really know very little about the economy of Pakistan, society of Pakistan, differences within Pakistan's different stakeholders, whether it is women, whether it is minorities, whether it is tribals, whether it is different provinces, from northwestern provinces to Balochistan, to the frontier agency, to Sindh, to Punjab. So, and then we have to worry about improving our information about society and economy in Pakistan, rather than concentrate only on polity or the civil-military relationship there. There was a time when it appeared that the civil society in Pakistan was wielding some influence. There was a time when it appeared that the judiciary in Pakistan would be spearheading this resistance pushback against the army. But right now, we do not know what the state of the relationship is and how the developments in Afghanistan are going to influence the politics of Pakistan. But we repeat again, I think it is worth India's while to take a deeper interest in Pakistan's economy and think in terms of possibilities of not only that India can do much about it unless the Pakistan opens it, but when India wanted to convey humanitarian aid to Afghanistan, it was dependent on Pakistan to do it. And India's dependence will remain to reach Central Asian countries, either overflight or road, as long as our relationship with Pakistan is tense. So we would re-emphasize that this policy document, comprehensive security policy document, it has a 5-year time frame. It is supposed to realize major objectives by 2026. But much can happen between now and 2026. So would this be a document which will actually change the goalposts, which will make a shift in the thinking processes? Would there be a reassessment by the army of, even if they remain the power behind the scene, whether they would find it useful remains to be seen. But it would be worth India's while to take a greater interest in Pakistan, going beyond the strategic and military threat it poses to us. It is almost 5 months since Taliban took over the control of Afghanistan. It was on 15th August that they entered Kabul, disproving all apprehensions that they might have to face great resistance. And they also tried to make reassuring noises to residents in Kabul and the rest of Afghanis that Taliban version 2 was very different from Taliban version 1. It was a new generation which was digitally literate, which had seen the world, which had lived as refugees outside, and they would not be as harsh or tyrannical or cruel as the first lot of Taliban had been experienced by the Afghanis. But unfortunately, the signs were immediately there that not much had changed. There was whitewashing of the posters which depicted women, etc. They imposed fatwas that the women should not go out without their heads covered. They should stop going to the schools. Anybody who came out with a dissenting voice was brutally punished. Women who were going out to their jobs in media or in airlines were killed and murdered. There was a total mayhem. And of course, that seemed that they controlled Kabul, but the writ of the warlords continued to run large in other parts of Afghanistan. The disgraceful way in which the Americans had moved out had left Afghanistan in lap of anarchy. Now, there also were suspicions that the Taliban were totally illiterate, they were incompetent, they would not be able to fly planes, they would not be able to fire guns, the sophisticated weapons which the Americans had left behind were disabled. But right now, we are not talking about all these things 5 months later. 5 months later, what the world is talking about Afghanistan is Afghanistan on a verge of a catastrophic human tragedy? The reports by relief agencies are that 97%, no less, of the Afghan people are facing a hunger threat. They can't feed themselves enough. They can't get 2 square meals in a day. Forget 2 square meals. Many of them can't even get 1 meal a day. There is skyrocketing inflation. Afghan money has no value. There may be some food stuff available on the streets, but it is so expensive that people can't even buy it. So 97% of the Afghan population is facing a threat of famine, of starvation deaths. Children are threatened with malnutrition, and this is a very tragic situation. The Taliban have failed to control this situation. Now, the Taliban come out with a very valid argument to some. It says that the Afghans have $9 billion in foreign banks, and they have been frozen thanks to the American sanctions. Had these $9 billion been made available to Afghanistan at the moment, they would have at least used this money to buy food, to buy medicines, and to provide some relief to their beleaguered people. Let's not forget that Afghanistan was always a very poor country. Afghanistan, the landlocked country, might have mythical historical memories of great glorious golden age in past, but in reality, in the 20th century, Afghanistan has been a very poor, impoverished country where there was great disparity between the rich elite living in Kabul or in major provincial cities and the common people. But the common people had enough to eat. They had enough to eat course meals, but they ate enough. But when the power politics took over, and from 1970 onwards, since the days of Soviet occupation to the 20-year-long war of the American occupation of Afghanistan, the Afghan economy has been totally destroyed. What has flourished is growing of crops of opium, narcotics trade, smuggling, contraband trade in weapons, and even flesh trade. Now, interestingly, what we must not forget is that the economy of Afghanistan for half century past has been dependent on the expenditure by an external power conducting a war and occupying Afghanistan. The problem is that we cannot forget that the Afghan economy for more than half century past has been totally dependent on the expenditure on war or occupation by a major superpower, whether it is Soviet Union, Russia at one stage, whether it was the United States of America on the other. Also, there has been no resource base developed in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a resource-rich country, but no industries to exploit these. Afghanistan has pockets of irrigated land where food grains could be produced, but the rest of the country is cold desert-like area. It is a landlocked country. It is dependent for whatever trade it has in dry fruits, goods, etc. A peaceful passage through a next door neighbor, be it Pakistan. Now, as long as the relationship between India and Pakistan is hostile, tense, the Afghans don't have the access to the markets in India. Also, the problem is that there has been a mass influx of literate Afghanis, professional Afghanis in disturbed times in past, much before even the Americans withdrew. So what happens is that we are left with a basket case at the moment. It is easy to blame Taliban for all the ills, but the Taliban have been denied access to Afghan money in foreign banks. But then the problem is even more acute. How long can the $9 billion, hypothetically, even if we concede they are released and made available to Afghanis last? What happens after that? after the dollars are spent. The relief agencies and the workers working for international relief agencies say that the tragedy of Afghanistan is that there is no hope unless the economy is revived. But what we have pointed out, where was the Afghan economy even for the past 50 years? Where are the industries? There are small karkhanas making carpets, making dresses, doing embroidery, having carpets, etc., dry fruits. No major industry which can be revived. Now, what happens is that there are areas of Afghanistan where they bore for water and the drinking water is not potable because it is saline. They don't have money to buy water. But it is strange that in a country which has been occupied for last half century, as we said, the common man thinks in terms of buying drinking water. The rivers might flow through the country, but it's a very ironical situation where the country has been made dependent on a packaged foods and a dollar economy and a money economy and bottled drinking water. Other categories of things are very difficult, medicines or nutrients or milks, etc., vaccine. Now, this leaves us with a very interesting situation. How does the world respond to this? If the world removes economic sanctions against Afghanistan, following the logic and the argument that the sanctions are hurting the common Afghans more than the Taliban, then doesn't it automatically lead to a de facto recognition of the Taliban regime in Kabul? And doesn't it strengthen the Taliban's hands? And how does it guarantee that the Taliban would not corner this assistance, relief assistance, given name of economic development, and strengthen their stranglehold over the rest of the country, or maintain a tyrannical way? So this is something which the whole world is very apprehensive about. The same kind of an argument we see elsewhere in the world. When there is a civil war in Yemen, the argument is there's a great human tragedy brewing there, so the world should respond to it. There's a great human tragedy brewing in Afghanistan. So the great human tragedies, the center of great human tragedies geographically keeps moving. And the new emerging tragedy distracts us from the older tragedy. And the fact remains that the relief agencies, whether it is United Nations or whether it is other multilateral agencies, are dependent on access to the area which is undergoing this tragic challenge. And that access is to be provided, can be only provided or allowed by a major power. It could be either the Americans or it could be the Chinese. In the case of a landlocked country, the problems are very, very acute. Now, Afghanistan is something which is hyphenated in the Indian mind between Af-Pak challenge in our border. The Americans had almost persuaded Indians to commit massive amount of money, billions of dollars in Afghanistan, to project its strategic depth and acquire strategic depth and provoke Pakistan. Afghanistan remains interesting for us for a different reason, because Afghanistan is the excuse for Pakistan to say that as long as the situation is volatile in Afghanistan, the refugee influx in Pakistan is there, Pakistan is itself a victim of contraband trade and Taliban terrorism, it cannot put a stop to that. And then they are diverted towards Kashmir. So the proxy war in Kashmir is integrally related to the situation in Afghanistan. India's access to Central Asia is dependent on relative peace being restored in this area. Obviously, Indians cannot be in isolation when the rest of the world, one way or the other, is talking to Taliban. Indians have done some efforts to reach humanitarian relief to Afghanistan, but can we do that without having a mission of our own there? Can our mission be opened there unless the security of our diplomatic personnel and relief workers is guaranteed? What happens to the relief which we provide to Afghanis? Does it actually reach the common man in Kabul or elsewhere, where the situation is even more disturbed, or does it only strengthen the Taliban, who are certainly antagonistic to our own interest? Taliban are dogmatic, fundamentalist, fierce, violent, and so far they have not shown that there are good Taliban and the bad Taliban as far as Indians are concerned. So what the Taliban have done in terms of administration or governance, or gone back on their assurances, is another issue. At the moment, the issue is, would this mean that if there is such crisis in Afghanistan, would it lead to the erosion of the power of the Taliban? What is the support base of the Taliban? Would majority of the Afghans prefer revolting against the Taliban than dying of starvation? Can a dying, starving, impoverished man rebel in a manner where it overthrows a tyrannical regime? All these questions are hypothetical. But the problem of a human tragedy of unimaginable proportions unraveling in Afghanistan is very real. That is all we have for you this week. Till we meet again, kindly ponder on these issues. What is happening in UAE? What is happening in Afghanistan? Can we take seriously the comprehensive security policy document unveiled in Pakistan? What is happening in North Korea? Is North Korea again going to destabilize the Northeast Asia, or is it trying to signal to the world to take it seriously and remove sanctions against it? Think about this until we meet again. Thank you and goodbye.